speaker tonight, who has already supported our organization by buying 2 books. Bruce Smith has had an active interest in the Civil War since grade school. In 1997, he was tasked to start a mounted patrol unit at the Arcadia Police Department. While selecting appropriate gear for the horses, he researched cavalry gear. This started a continuing study of the evolution of the United States cavalry. He has read extensively on this topic, both on cavalry equipment and tactics, along with cavalry engagements and the men who led those engagements. He served 33 years with the Arcadia Police Department and supervised the Arcadia Mounted Enforcement Team. Bruce and his wife own and manage Cornerstone Equestrian Center in Norco. He is a member of the Spirit of the West Riders, who you will see in the Rose Parade every year. He is a docent for the Lincoln Shrine in Redlands and a Civil War cavalry reenactor since 2004 and a lecturer on various cavalry topics, which he's going to share with us tonight as he tells us about Custer and the Battle of Trevilian Station. So Bruce, welcome.
I want to talk to you today about a battle during the Civil War called Custer's First Last Stand. There were actually 3 first last stands, if you count Culpeper Courthouse and Doobie's Crossroads. I picked Trevilian. It was the bigger of the 3 battles, and I've actually walked the ground at Trevilian Station. I've also had the honor of riding on horseback the Little Bighorn battlefield and participated in the reenactment there. And if any of you have ever been to the Little Bighorn battlefield, Custer Hill is fenced off and Reno Hill is fenced off, but the rest of the property where the battle occurred is Crow land. And the Crows sponsor the reenactment, and we rode all over that field, and it was very surreal. Custer certainly ranks as one of the top legends of our American Civil War and settlement of the West. He's very colorful, he's very controversial. People, historians included, seem to either love Custer or hate him. They tend to blame him solely for the debacle at the Little Bighorn, giving him sole responsibility for the disaster. Those who love him tend to blame subordinates and point to his Civil War record as a very successful military commander. With all the Custer controversy, I am not a Custer phobe or Custer file, but I've read extensively about Custer. I have 17 books on Custer. I have 18 now, thank you to your little auction tonight. But I've read extensively about him, and I can't help but be drawn to him. You heard Janice say I spent 33 years in law enforcement, and almost that entire 33 years I spent pushing around a black and white car. Okay, I liked to work the street. I liked handling emergencies. I liked handling hot situations. And if you don't critique yourself, now I don't care if you're a roofer or a plumber or what you do, if you don't honestly critique yourself and do a better job the next day, you're not going to be successful. In my line of work, it could be deadly. So there was always training, there was always critiquing, and then we decided in 1997 to start a mounted unit. And now I'm going to do this on the back of a horse. Horses have to be told what to do. Okay? The horse that gets ridden into combat, and I don't care if we're talking about Civil War or we're talking about a law enforcement application today in modern society, the horse would rather be over there eating grass. Okay? So you have this divided attention thing going on. You have to deal with who you're dealing with, and you have to deal with this thing you're sitting on top of. So training has to be to the point where I can deal with you and maneuver this animal and never lose my attention on you. Okay? The horse in combat has to be trained for that. The horse is not willing to run up against screaming Confederates or yelling Indians. He has to be broke to that. Okay? Try to keep that in the back of your mind. Custer and his military training, his officer-subordinate relationships, 19th century combat mindset, I can say with confidence if Custer had anything, Custer had guts. Custer had great faith in himself, and the Custer luck legend is true. Custer got into a lot of scrapes, and he got lucky to get out of them. And Custer's luck holds for him quite a while. It all comes to the end on the plains of Montana in 1876. But there were many scrapes, Trevilian Station being one of them we're talking about tonight, that he almost didn't come out of. 12 years, almost to the day, separate Trevilian Station and Little Bighorn. For this presentation, I'm not going to go into the entire battle of Trevilian Station. Trevilian Station was a 2-day battle. We're mostly going to be concerned with day 1 when Custer gets himself pinned in and almost annihilated by Rosser and Hampton. And late in the afternoon, he gets rescued out of that. I'm going to compare Custer's tactics to the Little Bighorn. Similarities, differences, as far as his commands involved. We're going to explore the first last stand theory. This is Trevilian Station and the Little Bighorn. On the top is the Little Bighorn. You can see the Trevilian Station is heavily wooded with patches of open areas created by small farms and clearing for the Virginia Central Railroad. The woods were actually harvested for the building of the Virginia Central Railroad. This photograph on the bottom, the Virginia Central Railroad is right behind me. Trevilian Station, these thick woods that were left, oh, I do have a pointer here, these thick woods, this is horrible ground for cavalry operations. Cavalry operations are done on wide open plains where you have the ability to move large bodies of men on horseback, and Trevilian Station is not good ground for that. On the opposite, we have open plains, low rolling hills, the Little Bighorn, ideal ground for cavalry fighting. And it was pretty ideal ground for the Indians too. After the Battle of Cold Harbor, Grant decides to cross the Army of the Potomac over the James River and attempt to flank Lee. And this time Grant's goal is to get Lee pinned into Richmond. Grant knew that river crossing would be difficult. The James is a very big river. And pontoons had to be brought in. And Grant faced a similar situation in Vicksburg when he wanted to get his army across the Mississippi. And Grant came up with a raid, a cavalry raid, and he called on Benjamin Grierson, Colonel Grierson, to draw off Confederates and the Confederate cavalry so he could make his crossing unmolested. Grierson led a very successful cavalry raid in Mississippi down into Louisiana. He used decoys, he dressed up men as Confederates, he had his shoes put on his horses backwards, and it was very, very creative and very successful in drawing the Confederate army away from the Mississippi River so Grant could get across. So Grant decides to send Sherman deep into Virginia to do a raid. He wants to pull off Wade Hampton and the Confederate cavalry, which he's successful at doing. And the Union Army is able to cross the James River unmolested. Departing the morning of June 7th from Newcastle Ferry in Virginia, the 1st and 2nd Cavalry Divisions of the Army of the Potomac departed under General Phil Sheridan. Sheridan is probably my favorite cavalry commander. Some people have asked, hey, who's your favorite cavalry commander? Sheridan started his raids off at the walk. Most cavalry commanders wanted to make a big show. Horses were galloped out of camp or trotted out of camp, and Sherman realized horse flesh needed to be saved and conserved. If you have an exhausted horse when you get to battle, the horse isn't much good. And Sherman knew that. He was a good horseman. The 3rd Cavalry Division under General Wilson stayed in camp under Meade's direction. And at this time, Custer is commanding his famous Michigan Cavalry Brigade, which is composed of the 5th, 1st, 6th, and 7th Michigan Cavalry Regiments, all veteran regiments with solid backgrounds. When Sheridan moves out, Wade Hampton is indeed informed of the large Union raiding party and sets off to intercept. Hampton and Fitz Lee, taking interior lines, were able to get ahead of Sheridan and his raiders. Trevilian Station is like Gettysburg. Nobody planned to fight there. They just happened to run into each other there. For 4 days, Sheridan's Raiders rode west, closely paralleling the tracks of Virginia Central Railroad. Detachments were sent out to destroy track. Foraging parties flanked the expedition, raided barns, kitchens, smokehouses, chicken coops, livestock pens, and collected horses. The need for horses was great. June of 1864 was unusually hot in Virginia. The roads were dry and they were dusty. The amount of dust started to take tolls on the men and horses the second day Sheridan goes out. Sheridan orders unfit horses to immediately be shot. He felt that these horses, even though were rehabilitatable, that they could be picked up by Confederates, rehabilitated, and used against him later on in the future. So if a horse fell out of line, if a horse refused to go any further, it was immediately shot. The trooper that was riding that unfortunate beast had to carry his saddle until he came across a wagon that had room to put the saddle and his tack in the wagon. The men who became dismounted were jokingly called Company Q. There was no Company Q in regiments during the Civil War. Sometimes the prisoner detail was referred to as Company Q. But these guys all ended up at the back of the line, behind all the wagons and the horses and all the dust, carrying their gear. And a mounted officer was assigned to keep them in line and keep them moving forward and not straggle. The heat and dust was so intense that one trooper asked the officer, "If I fall out of line, will you shoot me?" And the officer thought he was making light of the situation, and the officer just simply said, "Just move on up, do the best you can, keep up." The man pulled out his revolver and shot himself in the head. Neckerchiefs were not only worn by men, they put them on their horses to try to keep the dust out of their nostrils. You ever seen the nostrils on a horse? It's huge. And most people don't realize a horse cannot breathe through its mouth. If they get exhausted and tired, if any of you have ever gone over here to this place called Santa Anita where they love to collect your money, watch those horses run around the track, you'll never see a mouth open. No matter how fast that horse is running, no matter how fast that horse is pounding, a horse cannot breathe through its mouth and it cannot vomit. Okay, it's all got to come out the other end. There's actually a valve in there, a flap, that prevents anything from coming forward. Everything's got to go back. June 10th, Confederates were first to arrive at Trevilian Station, unbeknownst to Sheridan. The Union column stops about 4 miles above Trevilian Station. The Union column has been harassed through this entire march by civilians and portions of Confederate units that happened to be in the area. One group of Union soldiers who went out on a raid never came back to the unit. They went out to look for them and they found them all hung in the trees with notes on them. This is what will happen to raiders. So the Union column has been harassed all the way along. Hampton gets to Trevilian Station first. He's got 3,200 men and establishes his camp at Nederland Tavern. Fitz Lee has 1,600 troopers and he camps at Louisa Courthouse 4 miles east of Hampton's position. Sheridan has 8,000 Union horsemen at his disposal. This is a photo of the Trevilian woods. You saw the occasional clearings, but you can see where bodies of horsemen, it's just about impossible to go through this. It's small growth, it's very, very thick. The leaves just pile up every year. And this is not, I mean, Confederates could be 15 yards away and you're not going to see them. Very difficult terrain to fight in. This is a clearing. There's the Virginia Central Railroad. It still runs on the same site as the one that was built during the Civil War. And this is a farmer's clearing. But again, you can see you're very limited once you get your units into line, you get your cavalry out into line. You're not going to charge very far, a couple of hundred yards, and then you're back into the woods. It's interesting the Battle of Trevilian Station is not written about much. The Battle of Trevilian Station was the largest all-cavalry battle that occurred during the Civil War. Brandy Station had infantry units assigned to it. Trevilian was all cavalry, but it was fought almost exclusively dismounted. The Casualties were higher at Trevilian Station than they were at Brandy Station. During the night, Union scouts discover Hampton and Lee's presence and report to Sheridan. On the morning of June 11th, Hampton has decided to hit first and make up for the disparity in numbers, but Sheridan beats him out of the gate. Hampton wanted to strike the blue-clad horsemen head-on while still in their camps, with Lee striking their flank. So this is Netherland Tavern. That's where Hampton's headquartered. Merritt, Devin, and Greg are camped up here, and Custer is up in here. This Marquee Road is picketed by the 7th Michigan. Here's Trevilian Station and the railroad. Down here, well, we'll get into that later. That's not happening just quite yet. So that's the setup in the morning. At 3:30, the 7th Michigan comes on the fire from Wickham, from Fitz Lee's column, and a skirmish starts. Custer sends out the 1st Michigan to back up the 7th Michigan in this little firefight. It really isn't much. It's more of kind of a probing action. Just before sunrise, General Merritt's Reserve Brigade comes marching down Clayton Store Road in columns of 4s. A column of 4s is 4 soldiers in front, and then everybody's lined up behind. Merritt's force is big enough to push Hampton's troopers back toward Trevilian Station. They're already on their way out to make their attack. They run into Merritt and Devin and Greg, and that force is big enough to shove the Confederates back toward Trevilian Station. Hampton rushes to the scene, Colonel Butler and Wright, and their brigades are in a pitched battle begins 2 miles north above the railroad tracks, right about this area. Custer's east of the action. He's over in here. And a courier arrived with orders from General Torbert directing Custer to be on the move by 5 a.m. Head south, cover the left flank, and attempt to get in the enemy rear are his orders. The 3:30 skirmish over here delays getting the unit or the column organized, and they do not move out until 6. That's Major James Kidd, confident-looking young man. He's the commander of the 6th Michigan Cavalry. Apparently, he's quite an accomplished horseman, because as they're getting ready to move out in the morning, another officer brings to him a, quote, spirited and nervous fine black charger. Maybe it was Lexington. The horse was obviously conscripted during the march, and it's wearing a jockey saddle, not the regulation McClellan military saddle. Now, Kidd is so, so highly thought of as a horseman that this officer says, "Could you please ride him today and, quote, take the ginger out of him?" Okay, well that would make me nervous, first of all, because the guy who wants me to ride this horse he's leading the horse. He's not on it. Okay? And then the way this horse is outfitted, this is obviously a racehorse. In Kidd's memoirs, he insists that it was supposed that the day's activity was to be a continuation of the previous day's march with no chance of battle. Despite the early morning picket firing, which indicated the near proximity of the enemy, Kidd's own words were, quote, thoughtlessly acceded, end quote, to ride this horse. Now this is not the horse, but this is the best picture I could find. Little rabbit trail. You've seen these old pictures, how horses, how they run, how people painted them. It wasn't until Edison came up with photography at Stanford University that they were able to figure out how a horse really moved. And until that time, this is how artists depicted horses. Quoting from Kidd, "The horse and saddle certainly made an attractive-looking mount, but not such as one as a cavalry officer with a sound mind would select for close work on the battle line," end quote. Kidd offers this as proof that the officers of the 6th Michigan, at least the 6th Michigan, had no idea when they saddled up that morning that they were in for a fight. Custer's Michiganders were camped in a group of trees and rode out on a narrow wood road that restricted the brigade to move by columns of 2s only. So this is a typical road through the Trevilian woods. I picked this shot because this one would be wide enough to roll artillery down. Artillery was in, Lieutenant Pennington had a battery of artillery that was with Custer. So the road's got to be wide enough for artillery to get down. But column of twos is about all you're going to get for a cavalry formation. Colonel Alger, who's commanding the 5th Michigan, was in the lead of this column. He was followed by Custer and his staff, and then the horse artillery under Lieutenant Pennington, and then the 6th Michigan with Major Kidd on his mount, his new mount. The narrow wood road opened onto Nuns Creek Road. Nuns Creek Road, unknown to Custer at this time, ran right through a hole between Hampton and Lee, right into Hampton's rear. It was wide open. However, as the 5th Michigan came onto the road and formed fours, Captain Hastings, with the scouts, came galloping back to Custer to report a large enemy supply train, including led horses, which was lightly guarded just ahead. Now, I know we're talking about a railroad and train station, but Hampton's trains are his wagons with all his supplies in them, not train cars. These are horse-drawn wagons. Led horses, well, we'll do this first. This is a column of twos. This is a column of fours. Cavalry moves in file, which is everybody in the same line, twos or fours. And all your deployments for battle come from a column of fours. You go from file to twos to fours. Cavalry will travel in columns of fours whenever it can. It deploys fastest from this formation. Now, by this time in the war, this Michigan Brigade had seen a lot of action, and I'm sure they did it very quickly. However, if you're restricted by the woods, that's going to tie things up. This is a Frederick Remington picture, and it was the only military picture I could find that shows led horses. This trooper is number 1 in a column of fours. Troopers count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? The number 1 man is the horse holder. The others, you see the other soldiers up here fighting on this ridge, they have dismounted, taken the link strap, which is connected to the halter, and linked to the horse next to them. This horse is linked, this horse is linked. Okay? The lead strap is taken by this trooper. There are no horses tied to his horse. He's leading them, so he's got a hold of the lead strap in his hand. These men are taking the horses to the rear, to safety, getting them out of harm's way. At a bugle call, these men will come back forward and these men will remount. This effectively also takes away a quarter of your fighting force, because these men are now back in the back of the horses. But this is actually 1880s, based upon the cavalry uniforms and equipment, and how the equipment's carried. I could not find a Civil War picture, but this is what led horses are. We're going to talk about led horses some more. So, Captain of the Scouts comes back. Hastings, he tells Custer, hey, there's a train, Hampton's train is up ahead, it's lightly guarded, and all their led horses are there. So there's a bunch of soldiers standing around with all these horses tied up. So Custer's coming down Nuns Creek's road. They're just coming off this little wood road. They're coming onto Nuns Creek Road, getting in formation. The columns are coming up. Here's Hampton's trains and led horses down here. Nuns Creek Road runs right through. Fitz Lee is over in this position at Louisa Courthouse. Hampton is over here busy with this engagement. And this is all very lightly guarded. A small party of Confederate troopers challenge Custer. Custer sends the 5th to attack these trains. Custer and his staff are between the artillery and the 5th. And the 5th goes charging down Nuns Creek Road, and a group of Confederates come out of the woods and challenge Custer and his staff. Custer sends an officer back, and it happens to be Major Kidd with the 6th, and the orders are given to him, quote, "Take the gallop and pass the battery." Kidd gives the command, "Form 4's gallop march," and his own word was touched the black, which is the horse, with the spur. This sends this racehorse flying forward toward the front, followed as quickly as possible by the leading squadron. Now remember, we're already having problems with our horses due to dust and this brutal ride. Kidd is on a fresh horse that is trained to run. And off he goes. When Kidd catches up to Custer, Kidd says, his own words, quote, "Custer never lost his nerve under any circumstances, but he was unmistakably excited. Charge them," was Custer's laconic command, and it was repeated with emphasis, end quote. Kidd looks back, so the order he gets is charge them. He looks back and sees his leading squadron, which are your 2 or 3 first set of 4s, closing up. Kidd orders draw sabers, and without waiting for the rest of the regiment to come up, or even for this first set of 4s to catch up with him, off he goes down Nuns Creek Road. He drives right into this line of Confederates that have challenged Custer and his staff. And the Confederates scatter. This guy has got to be going at breakneck speed for the enemy to just say, you know what, we're not going to receive this charge, and they just scatter. Kidd passes through the Confederates along with his first set of 4s. So the 5th Michigan has already gone through. Custer and his staff are standing by. The 6th has passed the battery, and now they're going down Nuns Creek Road, at least with Kidd and his first set of 4s heading down this road. They're past the group of Confederates also. Major Kidd is obviously a great admirer of General Custer. However, Kidd claims he was never told how far to charge, and Custer's after-action report claims the charge was supposed to stop at the train station. Kidd's memo says no such order was given. Kidd also claims he was not told that the 5th Michigan was charging in front of him. Kidd rides along at breakneck speed, his words, for about what he guesses to be about 500 yards and finds himself in a position with no enemy in sight. He tries to stop the horse and realizes it's going to take both hands. I'm amazed he's riding this thing with just one hand. Kidd returns his revolver to his holster, and depending upon what account of this battle you read or this incident, some say he had his saber out, one account says he had his revolver out. Doesn't really matter. But he has to put his weapons away to try to slow this horse. One of Kidd's captains, Captain Fenton of the 6th, comes alongside, and Kidd hears the command to halt, along with hoofbeats. Kidd assumes it's horses from his own column coming up and fights to get the horse stopped. Kidd has to run the horse into the woods, into these thick woods, to get it to stop on its own. As he halts, he turns around to find a well-mounted Confederate officer who had been demanding the Kidd halt. The rebel insists on Kidd's surrender and uses language, Major Kidd's quote again, both profane and apparently designed to cast reflections on my ancestry and would complete the front cut on my head with his saber if I did not comply, end quote. In the excitement, Captain Fenton's gone. He didn't bother to stop. Maybe not seeing what happened to his major. And Fenton eventually catches up to the rest of the 5th. Several other mounted Confederates appear and surround Kidd with carbines at the ready. Now there's an unwritten rule with cavalry officers: if you're still mounted, you do not surrender. Although still mounted, Kidd decided it best to dismount and give up the horse and saddle. Kidd claims he was glad to be rid of them on any terms. After about 10 minutes, the charging 6th catches up to Kidd. 10 minutes. This horse, this racehorse, traveled fast enough. It took his command 10 minutes to catch up to him. That's a long time. And when the 6th catches up, the Confederates are outnumbered and they split because they don't want to be taken prisoner. And Kidd spends 10 minutes of his Civil War career as a prisoner of the Confederacy. This is Trevilian Station today. It was originally built on the other side of the track. I don't know what date this building was built. It's not in use anymore. The train does not stop here. But obviously, in the days of chop your own heating, with all the fireplaces, this is actually, if you go to Trevilian Station today, this is the train station. It's still there. So as the 5th charges into the trains, Hampton's trains, and led horses, Hampton gets word his train is under attack. Thomas Rosser, Custer's ex-roommate from West Point, and now a Confederate brigadier general, was assigned this morning as Hampton's reserve and needs no prodding to protect the train. Rosser's in command of the Laurel Brigade. If you want to do any reading about the Confederate cavalry, the Laurel Brigade was quite a distinguished outfit, and I'm surprised that they were held in reserve. But Rosser and the Laurel Brigade are in reserve, unseen, and they move in to save the trains. Hampton also sends many of his dismounted men to the rear to assist with rescuing the trains. So down in here, we have Hampton's trains. Custer shows up. Rosser comes in with his troops. More men are coming down that Hampton has sent down dismounted. And Fitz-Lee's troops all of a sudden show up out of nowhere. After a 4-mile chase, the 5th Michigan captures several hundred prisoners, 1,500 horses, a stand of colors, 6 caissons, 40 ambulances, and 40 army wagons, all to be lost by the end of the battle. As the Confederates pour in to rescue their train, they effectively cut off the 5th and part of the 6th Michigan, who are off the map at this time, leaving Custer with only the 1st, 7th, and 6th, and Pennington's artillery. That's these 3 units of Custer's and the artillery. This box right here with the X in it, that's Custer's train. Custer's train is now caught up with Custer's column. Custer attempts to extract himself when he's informed the troopers of Fitz-Lee's brigade have attacked his rear. Custer's now surrounded and trapped in an open field with nowhere to get out of range of hostile fire. Custer's in a tightening triangle and spends hours in the hot Virginia sun shifting his squadrons and artillery, some mounted, some dismounted, in a desperate attempt to keep the Confederates at bay. It makes one wonder how many times Custer looked around watching his men die, and wondering when or even if Merritt and Devon would arrive before it was too late. Had the responding Confederates pushed their attack all together at the same time, this would have been over very quickly. But they don't. They're uncoordinated, they're uncoordinated attacks, and Custer is able to shift his men around to whatever area is the hottest at the time, keeping the Confederates at arm's length. Custer's men are also armed with a Spencer carbine. The Spencer carbine, they either had the Spencer carbine or the Spencer rifle. The Spencer carbine was a repeater and held 7 shots. So I explained to you earlier, with led horses, you lose a quarter of your troops holding horses, but now you have increased your firepower 7-fold with a repeating weapon. The Spencer was extremely effective during the latter part of the Civil War and was well liked by the men. Later in the afternoon, it's reported to Custer that the Confederates have stolen one of Pennington's pieces of artillery. Custer quickly forms a few men, about 20 men from the 7th Michigan, along with part of his staff, leads a charge and recaptures the gun and brings it back. He scattered the Confederates that were attempting to take it. Despite the gravity of the situation, Custer still seems to be very much in command and in control, adjusting his troops to meet any mounting threat. Custer's guidon bearer is shot and killed and grasps the staff of the guidon so hard that they can't pry it out of his hands, and Custer rips the guidon off the staff and tucks it into his shirt to make sure the Confederates don't get it. Late in the afternoon, Sheridan orders Merritt to form the reserve brigade and go to the aid of Custer. Merritt and Gregg's men slam into the rebels north of Custer, engaging in vicious hand-to-hand fighting and capture 500 rebels. Simultaneously, Devon's brigade hits Fitz Lee's line, drives back Lee and relieves the pressure on Custer. However, before pulling back, Lee's men are able to capture Custer's train and haul it off in its entirety. Matter of fact, at the end of last year, there was an auction up in Idaho. They auctioned off the items. Custer's uniform he wore at his wedding, letters to Libby, all this stuff was captured at Trevilian Station. Eyewitness accounts of this part of the battle compliment Custer on handling of his troopers, and these compliments come from both Union and Confederate sources. But not everyone's pleased with Custer. The 5th Michigan is almost completely captured, and the men claimed that they were not handled well that day. Many of these men spent the rest of their Civil War service or their lives in the infamous Andersonville prison camp. Custer implied blame for the debacle on Colonel Augur of the 5th. It was alleged Augur overextended his orders, charged past Hampton's trains, and beyond support of the rest of the brigade, subsequently drawing Custer into the situation. Custer's own after-action report, Custer reports he ordered Augur to go no further than the trains. Augur denies any such orders. Major Kidd, the officer on the racehorse, also denies any orders from Custer as to where to halt the charge. The battle is indeed a very close call. Losses sustained render the Michigan Brigade orders to combat for the rest of the battle. Custer and his men participate in the second day of fighting, but in a very, very limited capacity. By the end of the Battle of Trevilian Station, out of the 1,653 men of the Michigan Brigade that went into action, 361 are killed, wounded, or captured, which is a 22% loss. Custer is struck himself 3 separate times by spent bullets and comes out of the battle pretty much unscathed. Custer's legendary luck holds again. A spent bullet is a bullet that has hit something, ricocheted off, lost most of its energy, and does not have enough power to pierce somebody's skin. So spent bullets hit him 3 times, obviously doing him no injury. That's how close he was to the fighting going on. Who were these men from Michigan? Elements of the Michigan Brigade had been seeing action as early as 1862, with the latest mustered in as late as 1863. These men were veterans of heavy fighting, including the East Cavalry Field at Gettysburg, Yellow Tavern, where they're credited with the death of Jeb Stuart, Hanover, Aldie, and many other battles. The youngest recruit was 16, who lied about his age, and there were many gray-bearded men who enlisted who also lied about their age and their zeal to volunteer. Michigan only comes into the Union in 1837 and is considered at that time part of the western frontier. Therefore, few improved roads. The ability to ride a horse was deemed paramount, and men also had experience handling firearms, which puts them on an even par with their born-to-the-saddle Confederate counterparts. Patriotic fervor was very high in Michigan, and the supportive public cheered their volunteers as they marched to camp. Recruits were motivated with patriotic fervor to save the Union. Michigan even established a training camp for their cavalry. Organization of the camp was handled by the state. The training camp was established and excellent horse flesh was obtained. Actually, they took a fairgrounds that wasn't being used at the time. They converted it to a training camp. Officers were from the more prominent parts of society and were elected by the men. Basic training, a luxury to most Civil War volunteers, was conducted in an established camp. Barracks were built, kitchen facilities, the men were made fairly comfortable. Training included guard mount, dismounted drill, horsemanship, mounted drill. And although the training was short and inadequate, the men began to feel and perform like soldiers and began to develop an esprit de corps. The guys started working together, knew how the guy next to you was going to work. Very, very important in having an effective organization. After the train ride to Washington, D.C., the men were sworn into federal service. Drill was continued for several more months while the men waited to be fully equipped and armed. Michigan provided more volunteer cavalry to the Union than any other state. And of course, they also suffered the highest grade of casualties. Michigan companies were originally armed with the Burnside or Sharps carbine, which are single-shot carbines. They shoot a paper cartridge They have to be reloaded after each shot, and a cap has to be placed on the firing cone to ignite the powder that burns very rapidly and expands and pushes the bullet down the barrel. So when you take a quarter of your men to hold horses, you're going to really hurt your firepower because all those men are taking their carbines off the line with them. This is a Spencer. Spencer was around at the beginning of the war. He had a rifle, and he also did something to upset the officer who was in charge of buying arms for the Union, and the Union wasn't buying any Spencer carbines at the time. Some Spencer rifles were bought, and the mechanism that I'm going to show you was the same on the rifle as it was in the carbine. As a matter of fact, the 5th Michigan was not mustered in as cavalry. They were mustered in as mounted infantry, and they were armed with the Spencer rifle. And they carried that throughout the war. Matter of fact, the book I bought, if you want to look at it, is a painting, and it's Custer, and he's with the 5th. And you can tell because they have the rifles, not the carbines on them. The Spencer had a spring in the stock. This opened up. You turn it, I think clockwise, and this all comes out, and you pour 7 bullets into this chamber. You put the spring follower back in, you manipulate the lever, and that takes a bullet out of this chamber and into the breech. As you close this, it cuts off the second bullet from coming in. You have to manually pull the hammer back, but you don't have to put a firing cap on anymore. Okay? It has the bullets have their own built-in primer, and a firing pin strikes the bullet, sending it down range. When you manipulate the weapon again, it kicks out the old shell, feeds in a new shell, pull the hammer back, and you're ready to fire again. The caliber of these was 5650. They were very accurate. The non-paper cartridge, now the metallic cartridge, is now waterproof. We don't have to worry about getting our powder wet. And the men love them. Most accounts that I've read, once this was in the hands of cavalrymen, you could have gotten rid of the saber and gotten rid of the revolver. All the work was done mostly with the rifle and the carbine. The Wolverines had obtained an impressive battle record by the time of Trevilian Station, but their losses were such that they never rose again to gain their previously well-earned battle reputation. "12 years to the month later, Lieutenant Colonel Custer of the 7th U.S. Cavalry led a very different group of men out on the plains of Montana. Although the 7th had a reputation as, quote, the fighting 7th, the best cavalry in Uncle Sam's service, end quote, as Custer called it, in truth, it had not fought anyone, much less the Lakota Sioux, in 3 years. War comes to an end in 65. Officers revert back to their ranks prior to the war. Custer was a captain at the time. 1866, Congress authorizes 4 new regiments of cavalry, because all the volunteer units have now been mustered out. 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. 9th and 10th were colored cavalry. Custer is offered command of one of those units and he turns it down. He will not command black troops. He tries to get the 7th, 8th, or 9th, and the best he can do is Lieutenant Colonel of the 7th. In the summer of 1873, the 7th Cavalry is engaged in only 2 skirmishes on the Yellowstone, and 4 of the regiment's companies don't even participate. As a matter of fact, the entire 7th Cavalry never serves together until the campaign at Little Bighorn. Cavalry units were sent out regiment, maybe 2 regiments if you're lucky, out on the frontier. There was so much area to cover and so few units available that everybody was broken up and spread all over the place. The country was in a financial depression at the time, and the Army attracted the vilest and wickedest sort of men looking for a meal and a paycheck. There were some honorable men in the ranks of the 7th. Somebody going to say the Army's no different today? There were some honorable men in the 7th. Many rose to become fine soldiers. Some enlisted for adventure, some for glory, but the ranks of the regular army had deteriorated considerably since the Civil War. And these men were outfitted for the most part with surplus equipment left over from the Civil War. In October of 1875, 150 new recruits were added to the regiment's roll of the 7th Cavalry. The following severe winter of 1875-76 afforded little training time for the new recruits. What drill occurred was company and battalion drill and consisted of very little squad drill, horsemanship, or marksmanship. At the frontier posts, only 15 rounds per month were allocated for target practice. And according to one officer, this rarely occurred. Few, if any, of the recruits from big cities in the East ever gained any level of proficiency with the carbine, saber, or revolver. Most of the new men had never ridden a horse, and the bulk of what training they received was in very, very basic elementary horsemanship. Custer's attitude was they'll learn out in the field. Consequently, no time is devoted to close quarter combat training, no mounted shooting training, nor was any consideration given to acclimating the horses to gunfire or charging Indians. On May 1st, 1876, 2 weeks before the regiment moves out on Little Bighorn campaign, 63 more new recruits are added to the regiment. At the recruit depot at Jefferson Barracks, what little training these recruits received was in marching, military discipline, basic instruction, none of which would be useful in fighting Indians on the plains. I love this painting. I am just a nut for authenticity. And this is one of the best drawn pictures of a cavalryman I have ever seen. And every piece of his equipment. You can see the old Civil War equipment, the thimble here that the barrel of the carbine goes into, the canteen, the saddle blanket, the saddle, the greatcoat on the front. One of the things that these guys had that was new, that was not used during the Civil War, is the Army issued reins that came back and attached together and came down in a lash, which was used to whip the horse. Okay? They didn't have this during the Civil War. They had a one-piece rein, so if you dropped it, it didn't fall off the neck of the horse, but it didn't have this lash on it. This guy's uniform is 100% correct, and he's wearing a soldier-made prairie belt for his .45-70 cartridges for his Springfield. The Indian is carrying a Henry, wearing an infantry non-coms pants. I don't know who's going to win this. I think it all depends on if that Henry is in the process of closing or opening and just kicked out a shell. But this is going to be close. This is probably taken from Reno's Recheap, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And another reason this inset, I want to show you, the Army retires the Spencer carbine. By this time out on the plains, they want something with a little longer distance and a little more oomph, and a .45-70 carbine is chosen, and we're back to a single-shot carbine. Sheridan, who's the general of the Army now, he has Grant's old post, says this will help the men in their accuracy and slow down their rate of fire. So we've gone from a 7-shot carbine to a single-shot carbine. The Henry had 14 rounds. Yeah. Smaller cartridge, shorter distance, but for the close-in fighting that happened at Little Bighorn, a very, very effective weapon. Surprisingly enough, only about a third of the Indians were armed at the Little Bighorn, with a variety of weapons supplied by the United States government for hunting. The Indians got their guns from the government. Was that a question? Okay. The officers of the 7th were also a mixed bag. Most all had Civil War experience, but there was a glacial pace of promotion in the post-Civil War Army, and it took its toll, and many officers found comfort in the flowing bowl. Custer developed his own fighting style that carried him through the Civil War and had been fairly successful for him, though on occasion got him into trouble, such as at Trevilian Station. Hit quickly, hit hard, and attempt to surprise and overwhelm your opponent. Typical cavalry tactics. His reconnaissance, though, was lacking. He also made impulsive decisions on the fly, such as going for the train. Had he forgot about the train, followed his orders, he could have come up behind Hampton's rear and cut off about half the Confederate horse on the field on the first day. Impulsive decisions on the fly can work for you, but they can also work against you. Custer had a habit of keeping orders and attack plans to himself, choosing to direct his men as events unfolded and making decisions on the fly. I feel this is why Custer, in this way, Custer for himself retained control of everything. Major Kidd relates the morning of the 11th when they took out the fractious horse because they thought this day was going to be just like the rest. They were not informed that there was enemy in the area. Custer had his orders. He knew where he and his men were going, and they were going into combat, but he apparently chose to keep this information to himself and not inform his staff. Custer's orders were to guard Sheridan's flank from Fitz Lee's troopers and get into Hampton's rear. However, Custer seemed no need to share this mission or the enemy's close presence with his company officers. The temptation to capture Hampton's train seemed to distract Custer from Sheridan's original orders to get into the rear, which is every cavalryman's dream. Little Bighorn. Back to Little Bighorn. On the morning of June 25th, 1876, barely 2 weeks from the nation's 100th birthday, Custer leads his regiment out on the greasy grass of the Little Bighorn Valley. Custer's operating under orders from General Terry. Terry's in charge of this expedition. Terry's orders are vague, and Terry intentionally gives Custer a lot of latitude. In fact, the orders were verbal and not written. Custer has a reputation as an Indian fighter, and he almost didn't get to go on this campaign. Terry begged to have him released for this campaign. He got in some trouble with Grant, testifying against Grant's brother-in-law. And Grant finally acceded, and Terry needed Custer to make one big attack. They were going to finish the Indian problem once and for all. Now, as the 7th splits off and rides off, Gibbon, who's with Terry, calls out to Custer, "Now Custer," this is a quote, "Now Custer, don't be greedy, but wait for us." The columns were all to come together when the Indians were spotted and use all the units at one time as one large mass instead of individual piecemeal units. Custer replies, "No, I will not." That can be taken both ways. No, I will not ride off on my own, or no, I will not wait for you. Based on reports from his scouts, Custer concludes the Indians have spotted Custer and are fleeing north through the village, attempting to escape the cavalry. The Crow scouts also caution many Sioux. Impulsiveness, assumptions, and lack of reconnaissance are going to get Custer into trouble again. Custer quickly divides his regiments into 3 battalions. Major Reno is given 3 companies and told to charge the Indian village from the south. This is Reno's route, right down here. Here's the Indian village, this is Little Bighorn River. Custer assumes the Indians are fleeing north in this direction. Custer tells Reno, "You will be supported by the whole command." Captain Benteen is given 3 companies and told to scout one valley to the west for signs of Indians. Benteen's orders are also vague and ambiguous, and at best don't make sense to Benteen. Benteen attempts to clarify these orders and even suggests the command stay together if there's as many Indians as the scouts say they are. Custer curtly repeats his original orders and instructions and orders Benteen off. Custer and Benteen didn't get along too well. This is going to be the big fight to wipe out the Indians, and I think there's a possibility that Custer didn't want Benteen to take part of it or get any of the glory for it. So Benteen is to move over this way. This map shows where he's coming back from his scout in response to a message he receives from Custer. Custer takes the remaining 5 companies and goes up the east side of the Little Bighorn River and attempt to get around the Indians and secure the north end of the village to prevent their escape. The red line is Custer's line. The The charge is sounded, and Reno's troopers rush toward the village, front end of line at a gallop. Everybody is in a single line heading forward. That's this charge right in here. Okay? We all know what front end of line is now. It's all been explained. At first, there are a few Indians coming out of the village to confront Reno. Custer looks down from the bluffs. He actually is up here. He sees Reno's charge, makes a comment about the engagement starting, and rides off to the north with his 5 companies, never to be seen alive again. Custer makes contact with the Indian village for the first time and sees what his scouts have been warning him about. There are many more Indians, and the village is much larger than Custer anticipates. Instead of emerging at the north end, he actually comes down into the middle of the village and has to retreat back out. Trooper Martini, one of Custer's buglers, he was a Frenchman, barely spoke any English, is sent back with a note from Lieutenant Cook, one of Custer's staff, to hurry up the command and the ammunition train. That's the note. Benteen, come on, big village. Be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring pack. W.W. Cook. Martini gets through to Captain Benteen, who decides to wait for the ammunition train to catch up before going to Custer's aid. The ammunition train has fallen quite a ways behind due to the lack of enthusiasm from Army mules. Reno decides, for some reason, Reno decides to dismount. So now he loses a quarter of his fighting force. He's going to fight on foot. So the horse holders take the horses away, and Reno's now on foot at the south end of the Indian village. Fortunately for Martini, Benteen has him stay with him and his command, and he's the only survivor from Custer's 5 original companies that Custer took north with him. Reno has now been overwhelmed in the valley and makes a panicked retreat, better described as a rout. They go to high ground on the east bank of the Little Bighorn. First they go to some trees. They try to hide in some trees. More and more Indians are coming out of the village. They're pressing the attack. More horses are going down, men are going down. And Reno basically says, for those of you who are interested in surviving, follow me. There's implication that Reno's under the influence of alcohol at this time. And they charge up these cliffs to this high spot, which becomes Reno's Hill, where Reno holds out. Many men are killed on the retreat. It was a panicked rout. That's where Benteen finds him. Benteen eventually hooks up with Reno. There's lots of pictures of the Little Bighorn. There's lots of artist renderings. This, I think, is one of the best, showing Last Stand Hill. They've got the high spot. You've got Indians on all sides. You've got troopers. Nobody's on a horse. All the Army horses have been shot and used for barricades. Very risky call out on the plains, miles from anybody. And this was the guidon and the flags are placed in the right position. Custer's up here in the middle. This is his brother Tom. And I think this is a really good artist rendering of authentically what happened at the end of the Little Bighorn fight. Custer's sending companies out to block charging Indians, but the soldiers are overwhelmed. Countercharges are made to drive back the Sioux warriors with little success. Custer continues to attempt to gain an advantageous position and ends up on a small hill where he rallies his remaining men. Horses are shot, used for barricades. Custer and his men are fighting for their lives, but there are just too many Indians. Custer dies on that small hill along with approximately 210 of his men. This is the height. This is where the last soldiers are annihilated by the Indians. Prior to this, when these guys got up on this hill, the Indians backed off, got down into the ravines where the soldiers couldn't see them, and launched their arrows at an angle. And all these waves of arrows are coming down, just landing on these guys, and there's nowhere to go to get away from them. And they killed quite a few men with these bows and arrows. This time, there's no after-action report by Custer. Custer's actions were second-guessed, and his reputation for aggressiveness was used against him while the facts are still being sorted out. The newspapers of the day had no reluctance in blaming Custer for the entire disaster. Echoing whispers from Army officers accusing Custer of being rash, prudent, and the defeat being caused by Custer's foolish pride, quote unquote, filled the headlines. In time, other excuses surfaced: tired troopers, tired horses, carbines that jammed. Major Reno's actions and his sobriety get called into question by Frederick Whitaker and Libby Custer, Custer's widow. Fingers are pointed at General Terry, Major Reno, Captain Benteen, with Reno taking the brunt of the accusations. Frederick Whitaker is a writer, and he's an avid fan of George Custer. This occurs in June of 1876, and Whitaker is able to produce a 2-volume biography of Custer before Christmas of 1876. The book is a bestseller. It's interesting to read. There's a lot of conjecture in it and a lot of rumor. It's an interesting book to read. The Army's the only official inquiry into the Little Bighorn debacle is finally held in 1879, surprisingly at Reno's request. Reno's attempting to clear the rumors and restore his good name. The month-long military tribunal takes place in Chicago and vindicates Reno. Reading the transcripts, it almost brings up more questions than the trial answers, which is probably why there are still books today being published on this fight. Upon hearing of Custer's death, Wesley Merritt, who rescued Custer at Trevilian Station, said, quote, "Well, he hadn't anybody this time to help him out." Merritt may have been more right than he realized at the time. So what have we learned? At Trevilian Station and Little Bighorn, Custer keeps his orders to himself and orders to his subordinate commander short, lacking in clarity and substance. Custer also fails to accept blame and makes controversial statements as to the facts of the event. This is evidenced by the following. Major Kidd, a regimental commander, in his statement that he was not expecting battle that day and rides an inappropriate horse and is inappropriately equipped or trained for battle. There are also discrepancies in Custer's after-action report at Trevilian Station, as reported not only by Major Kidd but Colonel Auger, as well when Custer accuses Auger of disobeying orders and going beyond Hampton's trains and thus forcing Custer into an untenable situation. Both Kidd and Auger deny any such orders. Sheridan's orders to Custer were to guard the flank and to get into Hampton's rear. Custer forgets these orders upon seeing the tempting prize of Hampton's train and led horses, failing to fulfill any part of his orders. Major Kidd's charge finds himself alone and decides to stop and regroup again, not sure of what he's supposed to do. At both battles, Custer quickly becomes overwhelmed by enemy forces he didn't even know were in the area. Confederate General Rosser quickly responds to the crisis at Hampton's train and plays a critical role in pinning Custer down, and Fitsley attacks Custer's rear, closing any chance of escape. Custer fails to listen to his scouts as to the possible number of Sioux warriors in the village. Custer's seen all over the field, directing his troopers, which almost sounds like Custer needed control over everything. Custer had good experienced officers in his command, but shows a reluctance to allow them to do their jobs. At the Little Bighorn, Terry and Gibbon were converging in the area, but Custer chose not to wait for those forces to be combined before the attack. They were less than 24 hours away. The command would have been rejoined in less than 24 hours. Major Reno was told he will be supported by the whole command, and then the whole command rides off. Custer has great faith in the 7th, but he clearly isn't leading the Michigan Brigade anymore and possibly expects more out of the 7th than it can deliver. At Little Bighorn, Major Reno's orders are vague. Reno decides to halt, form a skirmish line. Some historians feel if Reno would have pressed his charge, stayed mounted, and ridden through the village, the outcome would have been different. Benteen attempts to get Custer to clarify his orders at the Little Bighorn and also questions the breaking up of the regiment in the face of possible large numbers of warriors. Benteen's concerns are quickly dismissed by Custer. The note to Benteen about the ammunition packs is vague, leaves too many options, but no one is left to explain the note. Custer had great faith in Custer, and I doubt he had done any soul searching on his past performances to inspire change in future endeavors. Cavalry tactics can be lightning attacks. However, there's a time when patience is a virtue. General Chesty Puller, who commanded the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific during World War II, said, quote, "If you have 1 hour to make a decision, you better use 59 minutes before you make up your mind." End quote. Good operations come from good planning, good decisions. Good planning and good decisions come from experience and being honest with an assessment of that experience, good and bad. Troops and officers improve with experience as they learn their jobs. Teamwork is critical to success in military operations. It's critical in most operations. I'm sure where you work, teamwork is important. Training can prepare you for unforeseen circumstances and help minimize losses. A commander who neglects any of these factors is asking for failure. A commander must be many things, flexibility and trust in your subordinates among them. After 4 years of fighting in the Civil War, I'm amazed at how little Custer's tactics changed. His relationships with his men and officers deteriorated tremendously after the Civil War. I see Custer relying on a single operational plan, which was mostly faith in himself, and past victories, an unrealistic assessment of his men, and not much deviation from it. Success can be its own justification, but does the end justify the means? When I think of Custer atop that small hill looking around in the hot June sun as his men are dying around him, looking out into the distance, wondering when Benteen and Reno would arrive, I can't help but wonder, even for a moment, if Custer recalled a very similar scene that took place 12 years earlier in June of 1864 in a warm field in Virginia at a place called Trevilian Station, and hoping for rescue and that his luck would hold out one more time. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir?
I have a horse question.
Oh, good. I like horse questions.
Okay. I think I've heard or seen a photo of a horse called Comanche, who this was the last horse that survived. But the point is actually is that the Indians killed all the soldiers' horses rather than captured them, is what I've heard. Is that your take on it too? That they could not, why would they kill the horses rather than keep the soldiers' horses?
Any horse that was not injured at Little Bighorn Battle was taken by the Indians.
Oh, okay.
The only horses that were left behind were wounded horses, and the Indians didn't take the time to finish them off.
Okay.
Comanche was wounded. Comanche was seriously wounded, and it was purely for sentimental reasons that he was put on the far west, which was the steamboat that came up the Yellowstone to pick up the troops once they were able to get over to the Yellowstone, and take him back to the fort. Comanche was never ridden again. He was saddled and cared for. He responded to bugle calls. He went out in formation every morning and marched with his company until his death. That was pure because that was Captain Keogh's mount, and they were able to nurse him back to health, but he was never ridden again.
But the Indians did, any healthy horse they did.
Any healthy horse they took.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
any healthy horse they took. Yes, sir.
Trevilian Station, the U.S. cavalry was 8,000 to 5,000. What happened?
A summary of the entire battle. So I tried to preface this, I'm only going to do the first day. And really, if you want to inspire me, I'll write the second day and come back and tell you about it. But one critical fact, okay, is the Union cavalry are armed with the carbine, and the Confederates, for the most part, were armed with rifles. This was dismounted fighting, and on the second day, the night after the first day, the Confederates retreated about 2-3 miles up the road and set up breastworks. When the Union mounts and heads up the road the next day, they're immediately confronted by emplaced Confederates with rifles. And the Union cavalry can't get close enough for the carbines to be effective. Okay? Yes, sir?
Two-parter. On his first last stand, Custer had artillery with him.
Yes,
I
sir.
assume this is small mobile field artillery, but I assume this is key to having him, keeping them at a distance. I'm curious what role that plays. And also, did he totally disobey his orders if they're to get into the rear? Isn't taking the enemy's supply train the ultimate getting in their rear?
He took away from his fighting ability to get into the rear of combat troops that could have been annihilated from the problem. Taking their trains, these guys can still fight, they're still mobile, they're still effective fighters. So if he'd have ignored that train, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, He could have attacked Hampton's rear, taken out half the Confederate horse that day, and come back and got that train. There'd been nobody to back up that attack, and he'd have gotten that train later. And then what was your second part?
The artillery. What kind of artillery did he have? How useful was it at holding them off?
It was very effective. I don't know exactly what kind of pieces, whether it was a Napoleon or howitzers or what he had. Interesting fact though, one of the scouts, one of the scouting trips, and Reno was the one who made the scout a couple of days before the Little Bighorn scout. He took a Gatling gun with him. As a matter of fact, he took 2 Gatling guns with him. And they were very cumbersome because there are no roads, okay? And this is a wagon. And Custer took no wagons with him. Matter of fact, one of the Gatling guns overturned, was destroyed, and a couple of the men that were on the limber were killed. So wheeled weapons weren't very effective out in that type of territory without roads to put them on. But Custer's artillery was very important at keeping the Confederates at bay on day 1 at Trevilian Station.
Wasn't that the same artillery officer that was with him at Gettysburg?
Could have been.
Because I heard that Pennington was an extremely good, very accurate artillery officer at Gettysburg.
You know, I thought that myself, and I didn't bother to look it up, and I probably should have, but I was also interested by 1864, if that guy was that good, how come he was still a lieutenant? That he'd have moved up by then.
Custer was specifically asking for him, apparently, at Gettysburg, and that may have been part of it.
Yeah, it could be. Yes, ma'am?
Were there women Indian warriors?
No. No, this was a very class society. The women cooked and took care of babies and put up the tent, took down the tent.
Sue had women.
I haven't, as a matter of fact, if any of you are interested in Indian fighting, I know this is a Civil War group, out of all the books I have, A Terrible Glory is the best book that I've read on the Little Bighorn debacle. And Peter Causen's The Earth is Weeping is the best single volume on Indian life. And I don't remember reading anything about female warriors.
Okay, but at this particular battle, the women from the village came up?
You mean when the bodies were stripped and mutilated?
Yeah,
Yes, the women participated in that.
yeah.
Yes, yeah, but everybody was dead. Yes, sir.
Now, were both cavalries, the Confederate and the Union, synonymous? Were they both the same, basically, in the way they trained? And if you got a horse from the opposing side, would it respond to your commands?
That's an interesting question. There is a standard way to train horses. It started, Susan, was it with the Romans or the Greeks?
The Greeks.
The Greeks. Do you remember his name?
Xenophon.
He wrote a manual on horse training, and it is amazing how relevant it is today. Okay? So when I'm teaching a horse to respond to my hands and my legs and my aids, that's standard training for a horse. So if I want him to go over there, whether I'm riding a Union horse or a Confederate horse, the motions would be the same. Okay? In my opinion, and I ride Union cavalry, so don't tell any of my buddies I said this, the Confederates were not only better horsemen, but they took much better care of their horses. They were more concerned about the welfare of their mounts than the Union was. I'm not going to, again, you know, you're asking me what time it is and I'm ready to tell you how to build a watch. But, yeah, I think the Confederates were much better horsemen.
Do we know who ended up with the racehorse?
Oh, we don't. It's not the one that Custer rode in the Grand Review. That was a different one.
The one
Dandy, is that what's his
that
name?
kid, the one that kid was on.
Yeah, no, we don't know what happened to that horse, yeah. Don't know if the Confederates ended up with it, or the Union, or, yes, ma'am.
Why did the Army go from a 7-shot back to a single shot?
I'm sure it was money. Sherman said that they'll take one shot at a time and they'll aim, take their time and not waste ammunition. Those Spencer carbines were made from Spencer rifle, Springfield carbines were made from Springfield rifles used during the Civil War. They had the breech modified and they were able to take cartridges. But again, it was the cheapest way possible to get these weapons out in the hands. They wanted something that would shoot further out on the plains. And they just didn't want to take the time, I don't think, to do a repeater. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You just said one line about how Custer refused to command black troops before he took on the 7. So by this time, were there whole groups of black soldiers that he didn't want anything to do with?
Yes, the 9th and 10th Cavalry were all black.
Did they have white officers?
They had white officers, yes, white officers.
Dog soldiers.
They were called the Buffalo Soldiers. Flipper, Lieutenant Flipper, I think was the first black to graduate West Point. Is that right? Yeah. Was it
Part of being in those units.
Henry O. Flipper? And did not have a very good career. There was a, it's interesting, I dozed in at the shrine, and one of my favorite things to talk about is the Norman Rockwell that's there, and it has a lot to do with race relations. And I'll get men who were in the military in the 1950s when Truman integrated the military. I mean, all this is going on, and it's not until 1950 the United States Army becomes integrated. And I get guys who were in the Army in the 1950s and said, it did not go well. It was not smooth. A lot of prejudice, a lot of problems, a lot of fights, a lot of animosity, and that took a long time to iron out. It's an ugly part of American history. Yes, sir.
Were the mounted rifles considered to be cavalry?
They were not trained as cavalry. Good question. Yeah, you were listening. They were trained as mounted rifles until they got to Washington, D.C., and they were mustered into federal service. And the cavalry command said, no, we need cavalry. And they went through cavalry training. They were issued sabers, taught how to use them, but they retained the Spencer rifle. So that was the one company of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade that had a repeater from day one. And the battle record they had showed that this was a very effective weapon. And why the general staff isn't taking a look at these things and evaluating these things and getting the best weapons into your people's hands as you possibly can. Yes, sir.
And you mentioned the 7th Cavalry as opposed to the Michigan troops they had during the Civil War. I heard that 30% of the 7th Cavalry were Irish immigrants, and you mentioned the last soldiers that was French. But the Michigan troops, they were really much more Native American.
Pretty much, yeah.
So
pretty much from, it was a Scandinavian country settled in that part of the United States up in the Michigan area. But they had been Americanized. I've never read about problems with communication, language barriers, or anything like that.
And I also heard there was a 30% desertion rate for some cavalry.
It was the highest of any of the cavalry units. A lot of soldiers would join the Army, get transported out west, get issued a horse and guns, and skedaddle for the gold fields in California.
Just remember what crowd you're talking to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This weekend is the Cowboy Cultural at the Gene Autry Museum, and they're supposed to have Buffalo soldiers there as reenactors as well as trick ropers, and it's on their website.
Oh, okay. The Autry?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a Buffalo Soldier reenactment group here in Southern California.
That's AJ's group?
I think so, but I'm not sure. If you actually found another one, that would be interesting.
They ride in the Rose Parade with you.
Yeah.
Because there was a second one trying to form, but that was 10 years ago, and I never heard if that was successful.
Was that Charlie Brown's group?
I don't know.
Yeah. Unfortunately, all us reenactors are getting older. And nobody's coming in behind us to fill in the gaps.
That's too bad.
I mean, reenacting is it's choking in California.
Not just here. The group that was in Glory as reenactors are still in touch and still reenact. It's like, these guys have been doing this for 40 years.
And it kind of takes away on the battlefield when you have half your guys are on walkers.